Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? Yes. Welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to see so many being interested in numbers. You know, it's not a natural thing, particularly in the area of communication. But as we just said, that has changed in the recent years. You know, checking numbers and evaluating what we do has become central to probably all of our work. Before we get into the panel, allow me to make some household and practicality issues. First of all, please be active on Twitter. You know, the hashtag EuropeCom is there, so use it and chat, as was said in the welcome session this morning. We want to trend. What we don't want is to trend because you see an all-male panel here. And this is actually very unfortunate and was not supposed to be the case. We were it's a bit like von der Leyen's commission. We were supposed to be fully gender balanced. But then, unfortunately, Tina Surnazzi is stuck in Munich because of the Lufthansa strike. And Paloma Escudero, who you saw this morning at the opening session, had to cancel and go back to Madrid for an urgent situation. So, yeah, apologies for this. It doesn't look good and was certainly not the intention. We're going to have about 90 minutes for this session. We will have 3 presentations, and then we hope for a very engaged discussion with the audience. Oh, this is my mic, thank you. A very engaged discussion is what we're looking for. And actually, I want to go right into the session and would like to ask you to get your mobile. Like to use Slido. You see it in to your browser and use the hashtag EuropeCom, and then you should be able to connect. Is this correct, Martin? Do I have to say anything else? No. And then I would like to ask you 2 questions. The first one is very simple. Should public and particularly European institutions invest in monitoring? We had 133% at the beginning. That was surprising. Okay, anybody else? So everybody says we have to do this. I mean, I wanted to say before, if we are below 90%, we should cancel the panel. But given, yeah, look, I mean, a turnout of almost 100 people and everybody is saying that we should do this. Now, why we would do this, 98% going down. Why we want to do, why that still means we have to do this. The second question is, do you think that your institution does enough or, is good in monitoring and evaluation communication activities and campaigns? Yeah, I find this quite surprising because, I think actually that most of us are very critical into what extent we can do this. But so that's very positive. Anyway, I would like to move right into the topic. All of us are very busy with measuring what. It's not that simple. It's easy, counting media articles we can do. You can count your followers on Twitter. But what does that really tell us? These quantitative indicators don't say much about proper impact. And this is something, I guess, in evaluation of communication campaigns, we often confuse. We're good in measuring output, or we're getting better in measuring output. But what does it say about impact? What is the result? And this is something I guess we're all working on and what we're going to hear about from the panel. And to do this successfully, and this is something I would really like to discuss with you quite a lot, we have to formulate KPIs. Because, just do something and then measure and say, look, that's amazing. We had so and so many hits and so many media before how success looks key performance indicators, we can say what we do. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking because we have 3 distinguished speakers in monitoring and evaluation. The first one is Frank Knecht, who is unfortunately is stuck in Munich. The deputy head of the strategy unit for corporate communication in DG Com. Is working in Brussels since 2002 and has run various communication campaigns, a few of which you certainly know. The EU and Me campaign that got a lot of visibility, the EU Protects campaign, both of them award-winning campaigns, if I'm not mistaken, and currently the Invest EU campaign, which is the biggest campaign I have learned that the European Commission has ever done. And this is what Frank is going to talk about, and he's going to present us how the Commission and DG Com has tried to evaluate and measure these campaigns. The floor is yours, Frank.
Thank you so much, Fabian. There, all right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Fabian, and thank you all for coming in such great numbers. It's I'm heartened to see that so many people are interested in this topic, which was not always the case, and I think it's a very important topic because evaluation is a basic management function, and we are dealing here with large amounts of money, large amounts of taxpayers' money. Taxpayers have worked hard for this money, and we have the duty towards them to manage it in a sound way. And evaluation and constant checking whether we're doing the right thing is absolutely crucial. To click forward this slide, I would like to start saying that evaluation is hardwired in the way that the Commission departments are structured. Evaluation plays a big role in all the operational units. So the unit in DG Com that you see to your left, strategy and corporate communication, is where I am in. We have got a campaign sector and also a governance sector. Oh, thank you so much. That is at arm's length from the campaign sector, so that the evaluation which is within the government is somewhat independent from them. But also our dear colleagues in social, in web, they also have their own evaluation functions. There are whole units dealing with evaluating earned and also in assessing the views of citizens to the famous Eurobarometer. And then fully apart from this, again at arm's length, at double arm's length, so to say, there are our dear colleagues from the evaluation unit in DG Communication. So you see it's a thing I believe that helps us as an organization to work, to embed evaluation in all critical functions. DG Communication is member of AMEC, the International Association for the Evaluation of Communication Activities. It had its last global summit in Prague last year. I was there. I found it was very illuminating. I can only recommend everybody to go there. I wished that more of our contractors would have been in Prague at this summit, because I think that also our contractors need to understand the importance of evaluation, and that they also understand why we are on their back all the time. So evaluation follows, of course, an intervention logic. I hope you are aware with the AMEC terminology. Inputs is the activities that you do, the resources you invest into communication actions. Outputs is a different word for reach. How many people, what do you put out there? How many people are touched by your communication? AMEC then has the next steps called outtakes. What do people take out of the communication? Did they realize what your intended key message was? Do they understand what is the brand behind the communication action? Does it touch them emotionally? And outcomes is then a further step. It's a raised awareness, going even towards advocacy. And then the impact, which is then also a change in minds or a change in behavior. At the Commission, we have simplified the AMEC terminology a little bit. We have taken outtakes and outcome into one category. And in order that nobody forgets these very important terms. My colleagues, and I especially would like to highlight Manuel Romero, have put together this poster, and I make always sure that whenever I see colleagues that they have this poster hanging in their office, because everybody, because that is really what should guide their daily thinking. So these are the 4 campaigns. Fabian has already referred to them, and I would like to talk you through our intervention logic. What we did is with one of them campaign as an illustrative example that shows what the methodology was for all 4 of them. And I will take the example of EU and Me, which is a campaign targeted at young people. So at the very first step, of course, there is the research. We have to understand people, we have to understand their concerns, we have to segment target groups, we have to understand what their values are, how they differentiate themselves from other target groups. And for that, of course, the Eurobarometer studies are our main reference point. But then there are many, many more. Of course, there are also studies from the European Parliament. There are studies from private sector organizations. In Germany, it's a famous Shell Youth study, which is very helpful. So there are many, many data inputs we can use to understand our target group better and to help design a campaign that really speaks to people. So in the case of EU and Me, we realized that that younger, or confirmed, the long-known knowledge was confirmed that the younger people are the more supportive of the European Union they are, and also the more expectations they have from the European Union. Then we look at the metrics that we put together. So the outputs, again, this is at the basis of our metric system. We want to reach a lot of people. This is a big union with 500 million citizens. We have to, as a small entity, and the European Commission is relatively small size and budget-wise, we have to make our most to reach out to all these millions of people. But that is not enough. We also have to aim further, and there the metrics, the KPIs that Fabian has mentioned are of course very important. So we look at completed views, not only how many views were there recorded, especially on social, how many were completed, what was the cost per completed view when you talk about paid social, what is the amount of media coverage and earned, what's the tonality. I just learned that we still must not believe the machines, that there's still a lot of human intervention necessary to correctly interpret the tonality of earned coverage. Did people understand the message, as I said? So there are different KPIs that help us to understand in each step of the evaluation circle where we are and whether we are on track to achieve our goals. And of course, the holy grail is then really to touch people's hearts and minds, to bring something new into their thinking, to possibly change opinions and also change behavior. Of course, whenever you set targets that are meaningful, you need to know your baseline. You need to know where you are come in order to assess whether it is realistic and ambitious enough to go to a certain point. And so we also use many studies to set the baseline to understand what is the current awareness of EU benefits. And we see that many EU rights that EU citizens have, many opportunities they are well known, but there are also some that are less well known and that possibly demand an extra push, an extra communication effort from our side. Whenever people do not know about what the EU is doing, then it's not their fault, it's always our fault, it's always on us to explain ourselves and to fill this knowledge gap. So this is a lot of studies, a lot of analysis that goes even before writing tender specifications, before selecting the media agency, before having done any creative work. So once this is done and the media agency comes with these creative guys and women enter the room and show us their work, their artwork, then we again have many opportunities to look at this critically. So this slide shows an evolution, a creative evolution from the very left side. That was the original pitch by the media agency. In this case, it was a consortium led by ICF Next. And through a series of focus group testings, the pitch was refined. People gave their feedback, and you can see at the end of the process the creative was maintained, but what was improved in many ways. Measurement then can continue from the establishment of the creative to the media buying, to the analytics that we have once the content is out there. And here I'm already, and I will stay short. I'm already at the end of the story of You and Me. These are the KPI that have been achieved with You and Me, which is a campaign which is now being wrapped up. So the reach, the number of the net reach would be 80% of the target's audience. We also look at recall. We also look at the awareness. Have people a bigger awareness after our intervention? And here are also benchmarks that when we take all this campaign knowledge together, we can establish benchmarks that help us and our colleagues to see how we are performing compared to the average. So what has worked? Having a baseline has really worked well. Understanding your audience, being always critical. Evaluation means that you have to have a critical mindset. And not be easily impressed by data, because all the data you get, especially from online advertisement, is very high numbers, but don't be blinded by this. But where can we improve? We hired an external communication evaluation agency, Deloitte and Coffee, and we also have found out with their help where we can improve. We have to improve our sharing infrastructure. Qualitative research can be improved. We also should add channels that we believed were outside our range. We look more about comparability and make our list maybe more mandatory when it comes to indicators and benchmarks. And as a personal notion, and with that I would like to end my presentation, what I learned, and I've been working in communication for 7 years, in terms of evaluation and measurement, it is more about just numbers, it's more just about processes and metrics and KPIs. It's mostly a cultural thing. It's evaluation means to figure out what has worked and what has not worked. And when things have not worked, we also need to have the guts to say it. When we are evaluators, we have to celebrate our successes, and we have to also acknowledge failure, and we need to create a corporate culture that allows for failure. If we do not explain our failures, if we sweep them under the carpet, the people who follow after us will do the same mistakes that we have been doing. And I think this is, for me, the biggest learning that I have done in my professional life when I was dealing with communication, and it's my best tip I can give to many of you. Thank you.
Well, a lot of food for thought. the end, how do we face, well, weaker results, and how do we face them is something we definitely would like to pick up. One quick question before we move on with the other speakers. Could you, by raise of hand, say who of you has seen the You and Me campaign or has witnessed it in any way? Oh yeah, okay, but probably this is not the average European audience, but still it is pretty impressive, that so many people here in the room at least knew about it. But this gives us the opportunity to move on to Philipp Schulmeister, our second speaker. He is from the European Parliament. He is the head of the Public Monitoring Union, and he has been working at the European Parliament for more than 20 years. His unit is no, not 20 years. Almost 20 years. More than 20 years sounds so old. Yeah. Well, his unit is busy with analyzing public perceptions and expectations of the EU. You work a lot with opinion surveys, with the Eurobarometer, of course, and you try to use this data to then inform your campaigns in the future. And now we're going to look at a recent campaign, certainly has seen a lot of parliament elections, and we are now going to hear how you rolled out this campaign and how you above all tried to measure its impact and success. Thank you, Philipp.
Thank you very much, and I'm really afraid of the clock there on the wall because he has papers that say 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute. So I'll try to not waste too much time on that one. Thanks a lot for having me. Thanks a lot for being there, so many of you today. I'll speak rapidly in order to get through my slides. The European elections 2019 indeed were quite a game-changing moment for Parliament's DG Communication. It was in many, many aspects a campaign of firsts, if you want, and I'd like to run through quite a few of these first things that we did and tried out. So in this election campaign, we actually had one single goal to attain, one single narrative to follow, a clear idea of our target audiences, a clear idea of our communication priorities to follow through on. And that being said, it is very clear also that, of course, the success of these 2019 European election was not dependent on the work that DG Communication in the European Parliament did, or the broader work for the European Parliament as such, for that matter. There are many, many more aspects that contributed to this turnout increase that we saw compared to 2014. This time I'm voting, choose your future, hashtags, bottom lines that taglines that we used for that campaign. The question, of course, is if we're looking at 42% in 2014 turnout and to 50.66 in 2019, did we have anything to do with that at the end of the day? And this is what I would like to start with, because that was, let's say, my own unit's key indicator, key PI for that campaign. From the very beginning, we had established turnout as the only available success factor for an institutional election campaign. It is the holy grail, if you want, for such a campaign for European elections. Can we raise turnout? Can we contribute to raising turnout? For the first time, we put a full segmentation process, a full targeting process at the heart of our strategy. We designed and we described out of Eurobarometer data, mainly, so out of publicly available data. We designed and described 97 target groups across the 27 member states. UK came, as you all know, very late to the party of participating in the European elections. So we focused on the 27 for most of the way. And our targets had to have, quite simplified, two qualifications. They should, by and large, be pro-Europeans, and they should have a dormant potential for voter mobilization. We called them soft abstainers. So basically, people who, for example, in 2014 did not vote for technical reasons. I don't know where to go to, the weather is nice, I'd like to go for a picnic or anything else, let's see if there is time left. All these factors we tried to group and define our target group. And then the approach to really streamline through all the communication channels, all events, all tools, to effectively and efficiently reach out and engage with these audiences. So we run these targeting strategy country by country, socio-demographic group one after the other, to really to describe as much as possible their media, their communication habits, their topics, their interests, how can I reach them, in order to define the campaign by that one, or lay the groundwork for this specific convince some part of our campaign. If we're looking at the results, and now the evaluation, first part of the evaluation comes from, which you already had at the beginning when coming in, our post-electoral Eurobarometer survey that we run directly after the elections. We all know the turnout increased by 8 percentage points to 50.6. But what you can see from this data is soft abstainers went to a significantly higher degree to vote. We see a clear increase in this proportion. We see 72% of our chosen target groups have an increase in turnout. 50% of our target groups had a turnout higher than the national level. Overall, the turnout of only our target group population throughout the 28 member states was at 58.3%, so 8% higher than the EU turnout. One of our main target groups in general was youth, young citizens, first-time voters, students. We very clearly see from the post-electoral, they drove the turnout up. 42% of this age group voted in the European elections. That's a doubling compared to 2014. Just a few examples. Spain went up from 27% to 68%, a plus of 41 percentage points. Romania, plus 33 percentage points for students. Netherlands, 29 points up, for example, for the age group 25-39. So we have these success stories for the different target groups that we chose throughout the European Union. Still, the question remains, our campaign, does it have anything to do with that? Turnout could have been just climate change or external. We had it in the opening session this morning. This was not the result of the clever campaign of the European Parliament or anyone else. This was just the topics that were on the table. I agree to a certain point, but I believe that we asked the right question and that we found the right groups to talk to. And we asked the question, the post-electoral, do you remember having heard, seen, listened to messages from the European Parliament encouraging you to vote? On European average, 44% said, yes, I do. Great variation from claimed 85% in the Netherlands to 24% down in Bulgaria, but at least with 44% on average, quite a reasonable result. Becomes more interesting if we are crossing that, or if we're looking at the turnout compared respondents who saw messages or recalled messages and turnout of respondents who did not see the messages. Here you can quite clearly see that in most of the countries, the turnout of respondents who did not remember messages from the Parliament was significantly lower than the national result, and significantly higher was the turnout of respondents who do recall having seen messages. So, even if there is no clear identifiable link between the campaign on the one hand and on the turnout, this data from the post-electoral would show us in this evaluation that yes, we made an impact. The campaign made an impact, or at least the questions that we asked, the topics that we raised, the people that we spoke to met the target, hit basically those parts of the population that at the end of the day made the biggest difference in turnout. Now the next question, of course, is the goal was achieved, but how? As I said, the campaign was a campaign of firsts, and another first was a new approach for a systematic and simple at the same time reporting of activities. This continuous evaluation over 1 year showed us exactly where we started from, the baseline, how things stood at every point of the way, which efforts should be made, where and when. So next to audience insight, a clear targeting, we based our work as DG Communication on a quite rigorous analysis of evidence, audiences, channels, efficiency, return on investment, impact, all through the way. We structured it by 4 activities and 4 pillars of reporting. 4 types of activities: media activity, offline media, TV, press; digital social activity, online advertising, exposure, social networks, communities, influencers, website; public events that Parliament organized; journalist events. 4 pillars of reporting. So we looked at each of these activity types against 4 dimensions. The reach, the reach we achieved through across the different channels, measuring the volumes, measuring the absolute scale. The level of engagement generated, so the measures of affinity, of interaction with communications, of behaviors connected to communication. We measured the degree of resonance felt by the activities, mostly with live activities or experiences like events. And of course, the impact made, so the measures of outcomes from the activities. And that allowed us to basically, is that mine? No. That allowed us basically to put it up in a matrix, comprehensive matrix on the different campaign types, on the different pillars that we want to look. We worked with internal measurement tools that we have, with external, additional, outside tools, Google AdWords, Google Trends, of course, our Eurobarometer survey that we had, in order at the end of the day, arrive at a total of approximately 275,000 lines of data on 27,000 activities that we tracked over this 1 year, interviews with the different stakeholders within and without DG Communication. We had monthly reporting that were broadly shared within the organization with our stakeholders, where we are, what needs to be corrected at which point in time, which I think I can make it in the last 2 minutes that you gave me. Track, control, correct. We had a strategy executed according to a very clear, predefined set of campaign phases. And the reporting across these different phases, across this year, helped us to track what we are doing, to control the different pillars, the different measurements, and to correct the phased approach in order to build the momentum that we wanted to achieve. For example, constant A/B testing, constant analysis of impact on social media by our webcom people. So it helped us to remain attentive to sustaining, to building the activity reach, the engagement, the resonance, the impact, week by week. And this is the first time at the end of the day that we had such an in-campaign analysis and a benchmarked recommendation week per week. It allowed us also to reduce, if you want, outlier activities. When we saw from the different countries or from different units that they are engaging in activities that are not within the streamlined approach of the campaign, we could track it in time and we could stop that, if you want, and say, focus again, stay on message, stay on the key messages that you want to talk about. And that's it. I started with a naval image. I stop with a naval image. So the fog more or less is gone. But for us, of course, also this is not the end. This is actually the start of a process. We learn from that. We have a ton of takeaways that we now need to engage and work with over the next 5 years. If I come back to my target groups, last sentence, what happened was that people whom we called soft abstainers, so people who did not vote in 2014, went to vote in 2009. A variety of reasons. Key of those is by voting I can make things change. So we have an empowered, informed, mostly young electorate that drove these elections. Are they going to stay automatically? Are they now in my camp? Will they stay forever? Can I close the door and look at something else? No. These people are as easily gone in 2019 if we do not deliver, as difficult as it was to get them now in 2000. It will be as easily gone in 2024 as we got them in 2019. So engaging with them in a structured and evaluated process over the next 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. I'm not going to elections because A, that was done in the morning, and as we just said, you know, you're not representative enough to see what the impact of your campaign was. Before we move to the discussion, I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Richard Eddy. Richard is co-founder and director of ACAS, which is a London-based consultancy company focusing on audience strategy and impact measurement. Richard and ACAS work with a variety of international organizations, amongst others the OECD, the World Bank Group, the IMF, the EIB, I have to admit in that regard. The company helps audience and impact strategies. Before that, Richard worked at the BBC, and he describes himself on his website as being passionate about using the power of data. So Richard, please share your passion with us and tell us how we use the power of data. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Everyone can hear me clearly? Excellent. First thing I'd like to say is thank you very much for all coming to a session about numbers and data. 5 years ago, I'm not sure this room would have been as heavily filled as it is now, so that's great. Secondly, I think we can all be really excited by the progress we've made in this space. Frank and Philippe have given you some really world-class, best-in-class examples of how measurement can really make a difference. So what I'm hoping to bring to you today is an insight, an external perspective, not from within the institutions in Europe, but some external perspectives of what we've learned about becoming an impacts-led organization, what you need to do. So the problem we've seen is that most non-profit institutions really do want to understand the difference they're making, but they spend most of their time looking at output measures, outcome measures, and some engagement measures, but less time on impact. So what have we learned over the last few years? Well, we want to share a possible approach that's been developed through working with a number of institutions, foundations, and media. And actually, you'll find, which is good news, that there's a lot of consistency in the different ways you've seen today of approaching impact measurements. There's a logic to what we're trying to do. And so the framework that we've developed with these other organizations is simply around understanding your inputs, understanding the content you're producing, understanding the metrics, output metrics, especially in the digital and social space. And then critically, when you're thinking about the audiences that you want to engage, breaking those audiences down into the publics or individuals, into influencers, and into decision makers. And at the very end, trying to be clear about what is your ultimate impact. And in much more detail, what we've learned is that organizations often don't collect all of this data. It depends on the size of the organization. It depends on their ultimate objectives. So the framework is almost like a menu in which you can look at the data and stories you're collecting. And by the way, the headline of this session is about numbers and data, but we shouldn't forget the really impactful place that stories have when we're looking at the difference we're making. You can't get anywhere without the data, but stories often bring more life and color to your data story and can sometimes move people more than just the pure numbers. So what we have here is a much more detailed breakdown of what is under each of the 7 areas. And the area I'd like to focus on just a bit is around what we're calling real-world impacts. We think that organizations can do much more in understanding the impacts they're having by breaking them down into the public. So have you changed awareness, attitudes, actions, perceptions? Have you led the public to take any collective action? And are there individual stories that may give color to some of your data? And then with influencers, again, have you changed their awareness of your issue, your campaign, their attitudes, and their actions? And interestingly, we also consider the media to be in that influencer element. Are they amplifying your story in any way? It was really refreshing to see how Frank talked about some of the things that they've learned that they need to improve. And one of the areas we see great improvement is needed on is engaging television organizations. Why? Because survey after survey shows that the public's, that TV is the main platform in which they find out about information. Social media incredibly important amongst young people, rising very quickly, but don't forget the importance of broadcast media. And then we also look at any recognition or any awards that you might have had as a result of the campaign. And then finally, decision-making impacts are you reaching decision makers? The wonderful digital space we have now enables us to see whether decision makers through, especially Twitter, are retweeting your output or are joining up to your organizations. So there's a lot we can do there around understanding impacts by a much more granular level. So what have we learned with our engagement with all these organizations that we can share? The first thing we've learned is that we need to be much more systematic when we talk about audiences. And it was a great, when Philippe shared the deep segmentation that they carried out. This is exactly what you need to do before starting an engagement or understanding your strategy. Who are the wider publics? Who are the influencer groups? Who are the decision makers? Sometimes we're a bit lazy when we talk about audiences. We'll just say, oh, we want to connect with young audiences. But as you can see from this chart, there are many more ways of cutting audiences. And the more specific we are, the better, more likely we are to have a success in our campaigns and our strategies. The second thing is to realize that there's an enormous set of tools that we have that can make a difference. So we divide tools into the tools that help you understand what people are doing, and tools that help you understand why they're doing them, and tools that have a quantitative element and tools that have a qualitative element. And broadly speaking, we term them as either ethnographic, survey-based, analytics-based, or observation-based. And what we found in engaging with organizations is there's a bias towards working with the analytics-based, primarily because there's a lot of the data out there and it's really fun to use and you get an instant response. But we shouldn't forget the great survey-based work, and we've talked a lot about Eurobarometer, the brilliant Eurobarometer surveys, and they can be really engaging and helpful. But we also shouldn't forget the qualitative dimension. Ethnography, focus groups, interviews, all of them help give us a bit of depth into why people are doing things. And observational work, especially biometrics, is giving us an understanding that whilst observing people of why they're engaging in a campaign and why they're not. And then tracking the different outputs is really an opportunity, recognizing that you produce so many outputs, and there's an opportunity, depending on what kind of your organization, to track the impact of those different outputs. One of the things we've also done is to look at multilateral organizations and to see whether there are any patterns we can see. And what we're showing here is the average number of tweets per month of international and multilateral organizations and their followers. And what we found is a logarithmic relationship showing that the more tweets you push out per month, there is a correlation between that and the size of your followership. Now, obviously there may be other factors involved, but it's interesting. If you don't push out enough output, then people can't engage with you. Obviously, it's got to be the right output, and that's another dimension to think about. But it's interesting to see that unless you go above a certain level of engagement with your audiences, why should they follow you? And this is a data point to show that. Final two slides. But having an impacts framework and having a framework isn't enough. As we said earlier in the panel, cultural change is absolutely critical. So having a clear mission, what's the narrative of your organization? Have you got senior level backing to this way of doing engaging audiences? Are you directly engaging audiences, not just relying on your messaging, but actually meeting audiences where they are? Have you clarified your targeting? Is your content compelling and accessible? Have you got innovative ways of capturing data? Have you got regular reporting so you can track what you're doing and correct it? And do you have a disciplined approach to campaigning? And one thing about campaigning is that one thing we fear is that campaigns can often stop after a period of time. And I think we can learn a lot from the private sector. Some campaigns they have go on for years. Why do they go on for years? Because it takes time to really engage people and stay. So my plea is don't campaign for a month. Don't even campaign for 9 months. Think about your campaign going on for years, because we've got to win hearts and minds over a long period of time. And to end, a quick 10-step guide for developing your impacts approach. Be really clear about the vision or the objective of of why you exist and what you're trying to achieve. Break down your campaign into not just the public, but influencers and decision makers you want to engage. Be clear about the short-term media outcomes you want to have, primarily on reach and engagement. And on the outputs are the things that are going to help you move the dial. So really be clear about what kind of outputs you're going to be pushing out on your campaign. Obviously, raise money for the resources, collect the data, and then the critical last two. Formally, you'll review your campaign, what works, what doesn't work, and finally, adjust what you're trying to do and align to what you've learned works, and hopefully you'll have a more successful strategy and campaign as a result. Thank you very much.
And important for us institutions to also get a view, let's say, from the outside and from an expert that helps institutions to develop impact measurement. You've all been listening a lot. I have lots of questions that I would have for the panel, but I would still like to open it up to the audience first. We have a good 40, 35 minutes for questions. So please, the floor is yours. And could you briefly introduce yourself here and switch on the mic, because there are people watching outside of this room. So to be heard, we have to switch on the mic. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. My name is Jelena, and I'm a member of Committee of Regions, also municipal commissioner in Huddinge, Stockholm area. My question is, when I looked at the statistics, that what was easiest to communicate was like the Schengen or human rights, and what was the hardest to communicate was actually questions that are most important to people, like transition, education, starting new companies, what give us work. And now we are in a very difficult time, I would say, in Europe, where China and other countries are exploding within the companies, starting companies, innovations, education, and so on. And I'm quite worried about the transformation to digital society, where a lot of people are going to be left behind. And why do you think it's so hard to tell people how important things we do to kind of create new jobs, create new businesses, and also like in the cohesion policy with all the social funds, where we actually finance both education for people to move on to different areas, but also starting up new companies. Why? And when you talk to people, I mean, what are they worried about? They're worried about the future. What? That the kids have jobs, that they have jobs, that they can support themselves. So why do you think it's so hard to communicate the things that are so close to people's hearts and minds, and maybe makes it difficult to sleep at night?
Thank you very much. Frank, would that be a question for you? Because you worked a lot with analyzing opinion polls to base your campaign on.
Yeah, I will give it a try. Yes, we must not fall into the fallacy of communicating only those stories that are easy to communicate. We also have to try to communicate hard topics, difficult topics that are difficult to sell. And I must say I'm personally pretty hopeful in this respect. I think with the future Commission President, we have got priorities on the table that exactly address the issues that you are talking about. So the European Green Deal will have at its heart a huge sustainable economic boost program that shows that we can actually have a vision for a cleaner planet, a healthier planet, that also will create a lot of jobs, not only jobs for big companies. If a big company will build a huge wind farm outside offshore, there will be a lot of small and medium-sized businesses that can also benefit from this, all the suppliers of these companies. So I think the answer is, I think Richard has given part of the answer. There's data, and then it's also the question, there's a potential to tell a story with data. And there will be a lot of investment channeled into these future-proof projects, and I'm sure we can find a lot of stories, human stories, where people can also testify and say in a very authentic way how their companies have benefited from these new investments. So I would not say that the challenge is too big for us, even though I also recognize that it is a challenge indeed.
Yeah, just maybe would like to add one point to also bring it together a little bit with the data aspect of this session that we are having here. We can and we should, I mean, you can answer these questions, but you cannot answer them. You can find the right topics, but you cannot do this from within this room or from within this town, within this Brussels bubble, if you want. This is one of the key approaches that, for example, the Parliament campaign took now. By changing the direction, by trying to find out the topics that basically resonate or are asked where the people live, and to answer them there where they are. Not talk about what we think is important or what Brussels think is important or the European Parliament, but turn it around and try to find the issues and then also the language and the answers that resonate directly with the people there. And I think the data, Eurobarometer data, whatever you might take for that, can help a lot in finding this correct approach. But it cannot be defined only here or only from a Brussels bubble perspective. This hasn't been working so far that well.
But let us come back to that later because we have a lot of questions. The lady with the striped shirt.
Hello, my name is Bianca Baumler and I'm currently leading a midterm external evaluation of a very, very big EU campaign in Ukraine. So I have some very practical questions. What hasn't really come up much is cost. So a lot of these things can be very expensive. Some things barely cost anything, which means if you have a limited budget, you need to prioritize. So in a specific case that I'm in, when all the budget is dedicated to working days, about 100 working days among 3 experts, what would you advise as priority tools that require maybe human resources but no actual payment to any sort of source software or external actor? That would be the first question. And closely related, what sort of budgets do you work with? I mean, that's a huge question, but maybe this is more for maybe not the Commission, but person working on working with non-governmental actors, perhaps have smaller budgets.
Thank you very much. For the first question, I would like to look to Richard, because I know that he is very much into various tools and the costs of using these.
Okay. Just very quickly to go back to Eleanor, just one second. One of the big challenges we have is collectively, we are in an absolute battle for attention. So the average individual, some work done by the University of California a few years ago, the average individual takes in 34 gigabytes of information every day. That's 100,000 words from various sources. So there's a real battle for attention, and understanding your audience's language, as Philippe said, understanding the way they see the world is really critical. For Jaka's point about how to get information without spending a lot of money, the first thing that is incredibly helpful is to look for third-party surveys that are out there. So in Ukraine, you'll have a number of organizations, IRI, Internews, all of them have regular surveys that you can use and mine. And if you contact them, you might even be able to get some of the underlying data. So that's the first thing. Find out what the survey material is out there already that's freely available online. The second thing is to use some of the tools that are freely available online. So the likes of Google Trends, which is a tool that enables you to see what people are searching for online. It's available for searches for the last 15 years. It's available for every single country. You can do it use it in a very sophisticated way to get a sense of what's happening out there. And then thirdly, in terms of what's available freely, using Google search intelligently to see whether any particular URL is coming up on particular websites can enable you to get some insights. So I'm happy to talk to you about that afterwards, but there's a really rich opportunity to use freely available data out there.
A quick comment on the budgets. I mean, I guess, at least from my experience, that's why we sit here. Probably such a panel wouldn't have been interesting 5 years ago, but now we know that all the institutions pretty much invest a lot more in evaluating what they do. Philippe, Frank, do you have anything to add? Any details on your budget you want to share?
I once asked Jim McNamara how much, he's one of those gurus of evaluating communication, how much budget he would set aside for evaluation, and he said up to 10%. Now I believe that Jim had a little bit of a own agenda here, because his business is based on evaluating communication action. So that would be the absolute upper limit, I'd say. More or less, the benchmark at the Commission would be up to 5%.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that one. Question, of course, is how much do you, in our case, now take the Eurobarometer into that? If I can have anyone from the campaign team here from the Parliament, if I could have 5% of the next Parliament election campaign budget, my unit would be happy, I think, no? Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. More questions, please. Yes.
Hello, my name is Dumitru Marian. I'm Romanian and I'm a content producer, and I like stories, so I'd go with the stories behind the numbers. And the question is, what happens with these numbers afterwards? Because, for example, Romania, you said that the Romanian student voters raised from like plus 33%. And what I know as a Romanian is, by the way, I didn't vote because I standed in a queue for 7 hours, and I didn't get to vote because it was badly organized here in Brussels and everywhere around Europe. But the question is, what is the reason of these increasing numbers? Because my impression and my reasoning is that it was rather a vote against the actual power in Romania, not actual the one before, rather than pro-European, I'd say, vote. What is your impression? How do these data being analyzed afterwards, and what's the story behind the numbers, and what's the lesson that we have to take out of these numbers? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to say there's one concrete question in this for Philip regarding the Romanian case, but then I guess for the whole panel, this is something I would like to bring up. How do we use all these numbers? So these two questions, possibly you start with that very concrete focus.
Okay, very concretely, the post-electoral, of course, also ask for the motivation, why people voted, motivation, why people did not vote. By the way, we are quite well aware of the issues that we had with foreign Romanian voters, expert voting. Also quite an interesting thing to pick up, by the way, your country was not the only one. But I would have to look it up. And basically, as the data is completely publicly available, everyone can look it up, and it might very well be that the significant proportion of the Romanian voters might have had another drive or another motivator to go to vote, and why they actually went to vote, not only on the topical issues, but also what drove them. So one of the response options is always, of course, because I want to express my discontent with the national government. So this we would have to look up. As for how do we work with the data? What do we do with that one? For us, the data we collected during the election campaign and also with the post-electoral now will be the foundation and the basis for the next 2-3 years of work to build up, if you want, to the next 2024 elections, or actually to work throughout this legislative campaign. As I said before, keeping those ones who gave us their trust by voting is key. And we will see that the levels for My Voice Counts or voting can make a difference will drop. They normally do after an election. The question is, can we balance that out, and what can we do in communication terms in order to catch up?
Thank you, Philip. Now, if we make this more general, because, you know, we're all showing here how much we're counting and measuring and collecting data, but possibly a very direct question to Richard to start with. I mean, how do you recommend that your clients' institutions make use of this data in the right way?
I think I would say that there's probably 3 things to do and 1 thing not to do. I'll start off with the 1 thing not to do, but we can all fall into the trap of doing it. Be careful of using the data just to justify your existence. So you're trying to prove that the work you're doing is really great. That may mean that your particular unit or area survives, but means in the long term you're not going to be part of the strategic change every organization needs to go through. So the 3 reasons really we would advise organizations to use the data is firstly is to inform the strategy and the way you approach your next campaign. Secondly, it's to get you closer to the people that you're serving ultimately, your audiences, because the data shouldn't be seen as just numbers, but there are people behind the numbers, there are attitudes behind the numbers, and this gives you a unique opportunity to get closer to your audiences. And then thirdly, we'd use it to bust myths and biases that we all have. We all have some beliefs, we all have some biases about how the world looks. The great thing about data, when analysed well, it can bust them and help you do your job better by stopping the biases and helping truth come through.
Thank you very much. To elaborate on this, and Frank, you already touched upon this, and my question would be, you know, how do we avoid this? You referred to a cultural element or change, but how do we avoid these? You know, what we all know quite often, and it's called vanity metrics. You know, we make these nice dashboards and everything is just going up, 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 and it's all great. But so how do we face this challenge that, you know, we also want to be careful, because nobody likes to go to the top management and say, you know, actually, well, no, it was not a success, or numbers go down. So how do we tackle this problem?
I think it's a question of management. It's a question of encouraging the people that work in your team to try out new things, and tell them you can fail, but when you fail, fail fast and don't do the same mistake again, please. But failing in itself is not a bad thing at all. Edison has said, I have failed 1,000 times, but at the end, he said, no, well, the right quote is, when the inventor of the lamp, he said, I have not failed 1,000 times in inventing the lamps. I have eliminated 1,000 ways that it doesn't work. And that's the 1,001st time he invented the lamp, and he created General Electric, which is one of the biggest companies in the world. So failure is a good thing. Fail hard, fail fast and learn from it and spread the knowledge with the others. So evaluation is a management tool, and it helps to inform decisions, and this can be in real time. So if you now really zoom in very strongly, and we go to Google Ads, for example, the way it works is that you run several campaigns at the same time, and you compare them with each other, and you see campaign A has got a video completion rate of 80%, campaign C has got one of 50%. Where do I invest tomorrow my money in? And you can do it really on a daily basis. You can go into the data and you can eliminate those things that perform less than the others. So it's really a way of optimizing your investments.
Allow me quickly to come in on that one. It's not only, evaluation is not only a management tool. Of that, I'm convinced. We are talking, I mean, at the end of the day, we want to move people out there. But if we are not managing to take the people within our organization on this way to work with data, it's no use if the head of unit, in my case, is happy about the data and gets charts that all point upwards or whatever. Sharing the results of the evaluation in a responsible, reflected, structured way with basically everyone who has to know about it and who has to work with that is key. We learned that during this campaign. I learned it since I took over that unit. I mean, a few years ago, Eurobarometer surveys in the European Parliament were collecting dust. I mean, we were collecting the numbers and then the surveys were collecting dust, or immediately went into the round archive on the floor. Now we are telling stories with it. Now we are making the data actionable. Now we are making it operational. And still, we very much know that quite a lot of colleagues do not yet really understand how they should work with that. How should they look at data? How should they work with this evaluation? So sharing it, learning from it, the culture change, Frank, that you said in the beginning. This is one of the biggest things you have to take. This is also a bottom-up procedure, not a top-down. You have to take the people with you if you start implementing a data-driven communication culture. Learn from it so that at the end you start trusting the data and working with it.
Thank you. There were more hands raised here on the right. Did I see that? No. Yeah. There, please.
Hi, my name is Roxana. I work for the European Investment Bank. May I ask you for your opinions also on internal communication and measuring internal communication activities? Because there we often don't have the same level of detail or of sophistication that Google Trends or websites provide, but rather old intranet systems or much lower budgets and so on. So if you can share from your experience on that, how you measure internal comms. Thank you.
Anyone? Yeah, thank you.
From my experience in the organizations we work with, the internal comms at its the most common way is through the annual staff surveys or biannual staff surveys that are carried out. But then the most innovative ones use their intranet to do flash surveys of people, and I think those are incredibly helpful. Unfortunately, the annual staff survey can get quite politicized in how it's used, and so the flash surveys enable you to dip in very quickly with only a proportion of representative sample of your internal, and I think that's what we'd recommend, doing those, but not relying on the annual ones, which are incredibly important, but often the ownership of them is controversial. So those dips, regular dips, will be very helpful, I think.
There are, of course, different internal communication channels that you have at your disposal. So the same what I showed for an external communication action, where we went through different iterations until the final poster was decided. You could also do with a focus group of colleagues, and really the same questions apply like for external communication. is the message understood? We think we wrote a good message, but do the people understand the message? Does it touch them emotionally? Will they change their behavior afterwards because of it? So the techniques are quite similar, I would say. The same goes for when you have got internal events, the questionnaire after the event. So I would say the techniques don't really differ so much whether it's external or internal. You have got a different audience, a different target group, of course, but the principles stay the same.
Allow me to follow up on this, Frank, because you mentioned also in your presentation that you work a lot with focus groups, and obviously, you know, we have data, we have metrics, we have surveys, but focus groups in many ways, of course, is a very rich instrument. Could you tell us a bit more how you work with focus groups for designing as well as evaluating your campaigns?
Yeah. We have different groups, some that are more quantitative, some that are more qualitative. So I'm stronger personally on the quantitative part. We also run qualitative focus groups with 15 people in a room for a day talking about the subject. And I know my colleagues are doing this, but that's where I'm not so strong at. What I can give an example of a quantitative focus group is what I like a lot is a new trend, facial decoding. So understanding whether a certain audiovisual material has got the desired emotional effect on the target group. And we work there with different companies who hire online panels. They go through Kantar typically to hire online panels, and these panels are exposed to an audiovisual creative, often a video. And with the camera on top of their computer, their facial expression is measured second by second. And this is a technique borrowed from the consumer goods industry, which uses it since a long time. And we're using this to figure out whether the desired emotional effect has been achieved or not, or whether maybe the video clip has to be a bit, the cut has to be a bit different to do that. So these are techniques that involve at least 300-400 people. But on top of this, we also have smaller focus groups, but I'm not an expert on that one.
Richard, Philip, have you any experience, advice on the use of focus groups to evaluate communications?
Well, the important thing about when using focus groups or any either ethnographic or observation-based tool is to recognize why you're using them. So you're using them mainly to try and get underneath the surface of your data. Data can tell you often what people are doing, but it can't tell you why they're doing it. So people may give you an insight into why, for example, in the European Parliament elections, why they voted. They can answer it in a survey form, but what a focus group can enable you to do is to dig a bit deeper, challenge their reasons to see whether you can get any other particular perspectives. But the key thing is not to completely base your strategy on that, to go back and validate it further with further quantitative-based methods would be important, I think.
Okay, thank you. We have 2 more minutes, and I saw a lot of hands before. Now is the chance. Yes, please. Did I say 2? I meant 10 more minutes.
Quick 2 questions. One is for Frank and the other one for Richard. Frank mentioned before that you're wrapping up the You and Me campaign. I'm curious to know why, since it's one of the campaigns that has worked pretty well. And then Richard also commented it's a follow-up. They're really related to each other. Richard mentioned before that when one campaign is working, that mostly in the private sector, you tend to keep them going. So also to have your thoughts on that and why in certain occasions you have to continue with a campaign or change to another one.
Thank you. I believe I didn't express myself well. So when I said we wrap up the campaign, I mean that the current contract with the current media agency is coming to an end. That's what I meant. It doesn't mean that the campaign is discontinued.
So the point I was making, and it's good news that in that sense that the campaign is not coming towards an end. We talked earlier about the battle for attention, and most campaigns or most brand-raising initiatives, because of the battle for attention, really are not successful in terms of being wide mass population successes. So when you do get a brand that cuts through, you absolutely need to keep going with it because your investment will be wasted. For example, the likes of, and again, I think we can learn a lot from the private sector. When you think about McDonald's, I'm loving it. That's been going for the best part of 15 years. Coke, it's a real thing. That's been going for decades. And so, and why do they keep on with these campaigns? It's because the way our audience's mind works is that we're trying to impose a mental structure about something. So the EU and me, we'd want people to be saying that not just this year, but for the next generation. And if they say it for the next generation, it just becomes one of those things that's part of our lives. So think about campaigning and trying to get into people's minds is what we're trying to do. And that is very hard. And once we manage to do it successfully, don't give up on it.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? Yes, please.
My name is Veneta Paneva. Up until recently, I worked for a new funded project as an external contractor, and if we can agree, and I hope we can agree, that one of the main purposes of evaluation is to adjust behavior, if not change it to some extent, if not completely. I was faced with a situation, and the communications team was faced with a situation that the results coming from the evaluation of communications activities required changing what we were doing. And specifically in the case of paper publications, the results were such that it required producing fewer publications. However, there was a friction between the results of the evaluation and the contract that we had for a few years as a project. So that tension, that friction, was pretty much impossible to resolve. So how does one confront such a situation when you have the results of an evaluation campaign, of an evaluation, and the contract, which is pretty much impossible to change? And how do you address such a situation in an effective way? Because you can continue performing your evaluation just for the sake of monitoring and evaluating and producing reports, or you can suggest, as we did, to produce shorter outputs, which is what your target audiences want, and shorter outputs. You can suggest to go more digital. You can produce shorter outputs that have higher chances of being read, that are easier to disseminate, certainly easier to produce. But then on the other side of things, you have a contract that says this is what we have to do, and there is no way to, well, we didn't see any way to resolve this conflict. So how do you proceed in such a situation where you have your evaluation results that say one thing, and you have a contract on the other side that says completely the opposite thing? Thank you.
Thank you. Tricky one. Gentlemen, anybody who has an idea on that?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure who the question is.
It's a tough nut. I would get really angry at this damn contract. I feel for you. I mean,
It's very helpful.
but I think nonetheless, the evaluation was nonetheless a useful exercise. Even if you cannot make change for the better immediately, I think nonetheless it helped you to steer future action. So this is maybe a solace, but I do feel for you. Yeah.
No, but I think that's important because that's what all of you said before, you know, we have to face, or we have to be strong enough to use results to also, well, kill or criticize or question what we do. Obviously, unfortunate probably when you have a running contract then. But overall, from what I heard from the panelists, this is exactly what we want to do, get out of evaluation, right? That we stop certain things to it.
I mean, there might indeed be an issue getting out of the contract right now, but there is lessons that can be learned from that one. I mean, the next contract, if you set up a project, you should be clear from the beginning whether you want to evaluate or not. If evaluation is part of the project, it needs to be built in from the very beginning, also with potential consequences, meaning that the contract should be built in a way that it allows for modifications due to the evaluation process. So that is, of course, a lesson to be learned for the next time, and a takeaway, if you want. If there is no way to get legally out of the contract by any way, or if the contractor is not willing to adapt, then tant pis, unfortunately, to a certain degree. But this might be one of the key lessons to be learned. You want to do evaluation, accept from the very beginning that you might have to change it, plan for it.
Yeah, and probably it's also a lesson learned that one does contracts that have certain review points where you say we adapt what we do based on evaluating outcomes. Any more questions? Please.
So I'm a student here in Brussels at the X-School. I was just wondering, maybe there's a certain level at which the EU can't operate. Like you can't be on every website, you can be in every field you can find. There's a certain limit. I was wondering, wouldn't it be more interesting to get this information bottom up and work with these local fields, I'd say, and get this information back? It's maybe less specific than a global survey, but maybe you can get information for more specific terrains.
I would like to give this question to Frank, because you mentioned at the beginning that you look at various surveys. I mean, you mentioned the big Eurobarometer, but you refer to also more specific data and surveys.
Yeah, I can it's I should mention that there is at the Commission there's the central communication department which is called DG Communication, and then there are many policy departments which have their own communication units. And these units also launched their own Eurobarometer studies. So you would have also insight into thematic issues, into conversations, into values, into beliefs linked to climate change, linked to transport policies, to the role of the euro, to the free movement, and so on. So this more specific granulation does take place. And then, of course, there's also the national level where our representations, which are our eyes and ears in the countries, also are present. And they then, in turn, have got a network of so-called EDICs, European Information Direct Centers. So today there is a from the Commission side and from Parliament, of course, is too. There are networks all across Europe. So we don't try to understand everything from here, from Brussels, but it is a network across Europe, and we try also to understand beliefs broken down to themes, thematic issues. I hope this answers your question, or.
But real quick, like, would you get information like some websites where you know a lot of traffic is done? It's a silly example, but Reddit, for example, has a lot of viewers. Do you have any information that comes back from that to know what people are talking about online, but in less traditional media?
I'm not an expert, and I'm happy that Richard is. I can only say our social media team has got listening tools. And they listen to online conversations, social conversations, but I don't know exactly how they do that.
So there are a number of vendors that do amazing work looking at the conversations that are happening on publicly available and some of the private conversations on social media platforms, Twitter being the biggest one, of course, but some Facebook conversations. And you can get a good understanding of what's going on from those communities. But there's a number of dimensions here. The first thing I think is for us to not just think about us as communicators, but as engagers, which is a two-way thing. So obviously that's helpful if we become part of the social media conversation. But there are institutions, the ECB, the Bank of England in the UK, that have now got very dedicated outreach programs. And that also is an important dimension to have of our engagement strategy. So yes, you can. It's quite expensive, unfortunately, but there is a lot of work you can do with social media platforms. But we shouldn't underestimate the power of, where possible, just meeting people and hearing their language and the way they speak, and their perspectives where they are.
And briefly, and at the end, possibly, would be completely insane to rely only on Eurobarometer data from my unit. I would, everyone, not recommend to do that. No, honestly, the social listening thing that you were talking about, I mean, this has, for us, become one of the key sources of information, of evaluation, of audience insight, if you want. There are different data streams, and the challenge, I think, for us also as an institution, for every organization that wants to work with data, that wants to work with audience insight data, is how do we bring this together in a way that we see it, if you want, on the same screen? How do we bring survey data, representative survey data, together with audience insight that we get from social media, from social listening tools? How do we bring this together with media intelligence, what the journalists are writing? Very much into the, if you want, into the audience breaking down, as you had it in your presentation, to look at the different actors that not only we want to talk to, but also that we need to listen to. So there comes this engagement in both ways, and the ability, the capability to listen to those different sources of data or insight. And this, I think, for us also will be one of the key activities and challenges for the next years.
Thank you very much. Challenges of the next years is a good concluding remark, I think. A lot of ideas, a lot of food for thought we got here on how we should measure, how we should not measure, and particularly what we should learn from this in the way we design communication. Let me think, regardless, again, let's blame Lufthansa for this all-male panel, but nevertheless, thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you very much, dear audience, also the ones, as said, that are following via the web stream. There will be a 30-minute break now, and then we continue at 4:30 with various sessions. Thank you very much.